Hello and welcome to ShePack. I'm your host, Lanice Wolf, and today I'm joined by Candace Worley, an advocate in science, technology, engineering, and math. And she's a former executive to some of the world's largest security and SaaS companies. Now, in today's episode, we're going to discuss Tech Journeys Unveiled, her top 12 game-changing lessons. Candace, I'm so honored to have you with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So now before we dive in, how did this list of 12 game-changing lessons come about?
Well, I think all of us throughout our career, we learn lessons, some of them the hard way, some of them we luck out and it's the easy way. But I got asked to do a keynote for a group of college women. This is when Intel owned McAfee and Intel sponsored this event. And there were probably 250 college-age women there from all over the Northwest, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Northern California. And they asked me to just kind of come in and talk about what it's like to be a woman in tech, and especially in cybersecurity. And as I was preparing for that, I was like, okay, what can I share with them that I had to learn that maybe it would be useful for them to know at this point in their life so they don't have to learn it also. I mean, and some people will have to learn it anyway, right? But I put that list together as one of the slides in my deck to try to share some of that wisdom. At that point, there were only 10. I've added a couple over the last, say, 5 or 10 years.
Nice. Well, hey, no one wants to reinvent the wheel. So I think any advice you can share. I was just doing an interview with somebody else and she called herself a wisdom warrior. And I was like, yes, we need more wisdom warriors. So I'm excited to get into these lessons. Now, starting with lesson number 1, you mentioned calibrate your ethical barometer early in your career. Now, how did you define your personal ethical values and how do you ensure that they align with your career choices?
Yeah. So I had the incredible privilege of growing up very near both sets of my grandparents. All of them went through the Depression. They lived through that period in United States history where, every penny counted. It may be the difference between eating or not eating, depending upon that penny. And they always just instilled in us that honesty was critical to your character. People would judge you by your integrity, your ethics, your honesty, how you behave. Did you do what you say what you do, etc. And, that had an incredible impact on me. I had the luxury of having most of them up until about 7 or 8 years ago. And they left an indelible mark on who I am today.
Yeah. Now, did you ever have a situation where you had to make an ethical decision earlier in your career, and how did it shape your future choices?
Yeah. So this was actually while I was at McAfee, and someone sent me a PowerPoint deck that a customer had given us, and it was a competitive deck. And as I'm scanning through it, it had a spreadsheet in it that talked about growth and revenue and that kind of stuff. And when you double clicked on that spreadsheet or that matrix, it literally took you to the reference document, and it showed me like their revenue and growth numbers for like 5 years, which we should not have. I mean, we shouldn't have had it. We were a public company. They were a public company. Like, my immediate thought was like, oh my God, we shouldn't have this, right? So I immediately contacted our legal department and just said, listen, this was sent to me. I don't know who else it was sent to, but you need to be aware that we have it because we should not have it. I have not sent it to anyone else. I sent it off to them so that they could, do a little bit of investigation. And ultimately, they were right. They said, you were absolutely right. We should not have this document. We cannot be distributing this document internally. The customer should not have given us this document. Now that data would have been incredibly valuable, as you can imagine, right? To know.
I was going to say, you could have hit a gold mine right there.
Truly. But at the same time, when you apply the ethical barometer, that didn't feel right. it wasn't right. In fact, it was probably at some level could have been illegal given both were public companies. And so, that was a good test for me at that moment to say, okay, this doesn't really feel right. I'm not comfortable with the ethics of having access to this. And so, I engaged legal to have them kind of take it from there.
Yeah. No, I think that's awesome. I mean, I think when you first look at it, you're like, oh, it's a gold mine. Let's take advantage. But I think it's, you got to do the right thing. Now, how does aligning your career choices with these ethical principles just contribute to your overall job satisfaction and your sense of purpose?
Yeah. So for me personally, if I'm not ethical or if I'm not making the decisions that I think are right, I can't be happy in my job. Like I can't be happy with myself personally if I'm not doing that, let alone professionally. And here's the reality. In all probability, if I know I'm behaving in an unethical way, other people do too. And even if they don't know right now, they will likely know later. And if you consider kind of ethics and honesty and integrity part of your brand, then the price for that is just too high. And so for me, like having that ethical line that I just say, listen, here's where it's at. I don't cross it. It's not just part of me personally. It's part of my professional brand as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I don't think there's a lot of correlation with how your brand can be perceived. It's kind of like these like short, hey, this is going to work for me. Instead of thinking out how is this going to affect other people building trust with me and then even building that confidence because there's going to be other opportunities. It's almost like the other, you never want to burn your bridges because that starts to come back and that's also part of your brand.
Well, and I mean, right? Think about the fact that especially in today's world where a lot of us are remote, Lenise, like you're working remotely with people very frequently. And the way that works is because there's just an assumption of you're trustworthy. And that assumption is given to you until you prove you're not. And it only takes once. What is the saying? Like something about, filling the trust bucket takes forever. Emptying it just takes one mistake. And so like, especially in this remote world where we're not face to face, we don't get to spend as much time in person with people. I think that ability to make sure your brand carries with it, that you're a trustworthy, honest person is critically important in ensuring success with remote relationships.
Yeah, I love that. Now, lesson 2 you have is champion and cherish diversity. So why is diversity a crucial value to uphold in both your personal and your professional life?
Well, so beyond the fact that it's the right thing to do, research shows that more diverse teams are more creative and ultimately more successful. And so, for me, if you want a team that's, to use a cliche, going to be able to think outside the box more often than not, you need people that are different from each other, where that difference could be, race, religion, belief systems, but it could also be experience, the way they think, how they grew up or where they grew up. Like all of those things contribute to diversity. Not just the protected classes. I think it goes beyond that. It goes, where you grew up, how you grew up, like what has your life experience been like? All of that impacts the way you think and the way you approach solving problems.
Yeah, I agree. Now, was there ever a time that you felt in your career where you initially just didn't recognize the importance of diversity and then later realize its significance? And what was that impact?
Yeah. So, as a woman in tech, I've certainly had the opportunity to experience, lack of diversity. I think it's much better today than when I started, probably mid to late 90s. But, there's still a lot of room for us to have more diversity in tech, whether that's, more women, more people of color, whatever that may be. I think that we haven't quite got where we need to be. It's pretty homogenous. In terms of what a boardroom looks like, what an executive, table looks like. And so, for me personally, I don't know. I certainly have experienced that lack of diversity as a woman. in tech, right? Where,
Mm,
I was often the only woman in the room. And sometimes because you're the only woman in the room, it's hard to get a word in edgewise, right?
mm,
So I've experienced that. And I think I experienced that from the very beginning of my career.
mm,
I don't know that there was a point in time where I said, oh, wow, diversity is really important. I think
mm,
because I sort of was that one woman in the room for a lot of my career, it was always pretty obvious to me that
mm,
that
mhm,
having a more varied set of people in decision making was really important.
mm. How did that in ways though like help you with your mindset? Because I would anticipate other, people who are experiencing that, they can feel intimidated and say, oh, maybe I should just wait, or maybe I shouldn't be in that room. How did you conquer just your mindset and saying that I do belong here and we need more people at this table?
Well, definitely they should be in the room. So no one should ever tell themselves they shouldn't be in the room. They should absolutely be in the room.
Hmm.
For me, and this is probably a little controversial. Some people may not like this answer, so we'll go with it anyway. And, um, I don't think of myself as a woman in tech. I think of myself as a VP of product management or a general manager or a chief product officer, a chief technology strategist, or whatever my role is. What I lead with at work is my role. The fact that I'm a woman or
Hmm.
a man is frankly irrelevant. It should be
Hmm.
irrelevant. I do my damnedest to make sure it's not relevant in the conversations that I have. And I've honestly found that approach to be incredibly successful for me. I have had very
Hmm.
few situations in my career where I really felt like I was being held back because I was a girl.
Hmm.
And I think part of that is because I never led with that. That's
Hmm.
not why I'm at work, right? I'm at work to
Yeah.
like get a job done, to do a job, to aspire to the next job. And I've just always felt like as long as I focus on that, I'm being the absolute
Hmm.
best GM or the best SVP or the best, you know, junior product manager, because that's where I started, right? As long as I'm
Hmm.
aspiring to be the best that I can be, I just think in most cases, the fact that I'm a woman mattered a lot less.
Hmm. Yeah, I love that. What do you feel the steps that we can take to ensure that others are valuing diversity more today, even if they don't fully grasp the significance from the past?
Couple of things. First, I think every single one of us needs to seek out divergent opinions. One of the hardest
Mm,
things to do is to surround yourself with people who don't agree with you. Most people have a propensity to hire people who are like themselves, who think like themselves, who maybe agree and have the same kinds of ideas as themselves. And sometimes that works out. I would say most times it doesn't give you the best result. And so, my advice is to look across the organization, both within your functional group as well as within, the organization at large or even outside the organization for opinions that differ from yours before you
mm,
make a final decision to kind of expand your thinking. Second, hire people that are different from you. And then when they have a different opinion, thank them for it.
mm,
Because if you don't thank them for it and in any way, shape, or form they feel like, oh my God, I had a different opinion and that wasn't received well, it'll be the last time you ever get a different
mm,
opinion from anyone on your team. So it's critically important that if you're going to bring people into your team that have that differing opinion, that have a different perspective on how to solve problems and approach something, that even when they disagree with you, you say, hey, thank you so much for that perspective. I hadn't contemplated that. You may still make
mm.
the same decision. But what you've
Right.
telegraphed to the team is that it's okay to tell the boss that you have a
Mm,
different perspective that might result, produce a better result. I've seen it happen
hmm.
where a manager or leader shut someone down hard when they gave a
Mm,
differing opinion. And what you see in that team is that pipeline of differing opinions dries up very, very rapidly because nobody wants to give the boss a differing opinion and then just get slammed in front of their peers, right? Because everybody else is
Yeah,
like,
it's too
well,
embarrassing.
I'm not going there, right? And then I think two additional things: hire the best person for the role. So
Mm,
I believe in diversity. You should hire diverse people, but you shouldn't hire someone who's not qualified for the role. If you have a
mm,
role, hire the best person. If there's a diverse candidate that has equal capability and experience to everyone else in the list, definitely hire the diverse candidate because they're going to bring more magic to your team. And then the final thing
mm-hmm.
is when you see someone behaving in a way that sort of impedes that diversity of thought, diversity of action, politely call them out. You know, I've had situations in an executive meeting where I'd been trying to say something on a call for 15 minutes and I couldn't get a word in edgewise because everybody else was all talking over each other and me. And I had a male colleague like pipe up and say, hey, Candace has been trying to speak for like 15 minutes. Let's make sure we hear from her before we move on to the next topic. You know, and it wasn't
Yeah.
the leader of the meeting. It wasn't my boss. It was a male colleague who I adore who was like, wait a minute, we're missing a voice here on the team. We need to make sure that voice is heard. And like, we should all be doing that. You know, I greatly appreciated the fact that a man did it for me, but we should make sure as women, we're also doing it for other women and frankly, other men, right?
Yeah, completely agree. Now, lesson 3 you have is know what you love to do. And for so many of us, when we're trying to discover that, what are the key signs or indicators that signal you're doing something that you love?
Yeah. So I can only speak for me. If I'm excited when the alarm goes off in the morning, because I'm not a morning person, by the way. If I'm excited when the alarm goes off in the morning because I get to go to work, that's a really good sign that I'm excited about my job, right? If I have more days when I leave the office or I shut down my computer and I'm like, God, that was a great day. I really got to do amazing stuff. I accomplished a lot. There was some hard stuff, but that's okay. We got through it. Like, that's a great sign. And then I think finally, you know, if you have more days when you leave energized than you leave drained, that's a really good indication that you're in the right job and probably also in the right company.
Yeah, it's I feel like it's hard because there could be times where it's just like, hey, look, it's been a rough week versus, you know, oh, wait, this is totally off limits. What were some examples within your career of, you know, what you knew, hey, I could live with doing this versus what was completely off the table?
Yeah. So I'll take the example of being a general manager. So as a GM of a business unit, you know, prior to that, I'd been 100% product person. I'd spent my life in product management. I became the general manager. And what I found out very quickly is as a GM, you spend a lot of time in financial spreadsheets. Like your life is probably about 40-50% financial spreadsheets. And finance was never something that necessarily brought me joy. Let's put it like that. And so, you know, that was an example of something where I loved the job and I loved the responsibility and the stewardship of the business that came with that role. But boy, spending that much time in financial spreadsheets was really not my jam.
Wasn't your jam.
And what I did is I actually brought in someone as my chief of staff who was a finance whiz. That's Jeff Mayer. I adore him. Like, he was so critical to my team and my success in that role. And so I kind of brought in someone that I knew could shore up that area for me and help me get better at it so that I'd be better as a general manager. And, you know, that's an example of the job as a whole I loved, but this piece of it that I now had to spend a lot of time doing, one, I wasn't confident in it. And two, it didn't necessarily give me pleasure. And so I found a way to manage that by bringing in the right help.
Yeah.
And Jeff's brilliant. So, you know, it was just like a match made in heaven.
Yeah, that's awesome. How do you feel about what you experienced as what was completely off the table?
You know, for me, off the table, if I go back to very early in my career, I actually started my career with a little startup, frankly, little high-tech startup, which is how I got into high-tech. And then they couldn't give you a paycheck anymore, so I had to go find a job. And I went and I found an executive assistant job. And I was the EA to the president of a small value-added reseller company here in Portland. And off the table for me was, even as an EA, I don't pick up dry cleaning. I don't, take your kids to school. I don't do that stuff. And that was just a line in the sand for me. I'm not going to be someone's personal secretary. I'll take your phone calls all day long. I'll schedule your appointments all day long, all those kinds of things. But that was off the table for me. I'd get him coffee in a pinch, but he got his own coffee most of the time. And for me, that felt more, like a servant than it felt like a secretary or an EA. And that was just not something I was willing to do. And
yeah, well, it sounds like really clearly. Oh, go ahead.
Hired me, agreed. I said, luckily, the guy who hired me was okay with that. So it worked out.
Well, and it's good because I think, as you're kind of exploring and you're also identifying your boundaries. And I think what I just heard you say is communicating those boundaries, and either it's going to be reciprocated or it's not. Yeah. Now, I feel like, how do you set those personal boundaries when it comes to your career? And I'd even say your personal life, just to make sure that you're not compromising your well-being or your values.
Yeah. So I think this is going to be very different for each individual. For me personally, when it comes down to the parts of my life that I hold very dear, my family, especially, is number one. If my work starts impacting my ability to have, good times and relationships with my family, then I have to step back and start reevaluating, am I in the right place? And, I think, one of the things that you and I didn't talk about is I lost my father in April. And it really caused me to reevaluate, like, am I spending my time the way I should be spending my time? I mean, he was a man that squeezed every drop of life out of his 81 years. Like, he left nothing on the table as he exited, right? Which is amazing. And it made me think, am I leaving a lot on the table personally because I have focused so much on my career for the last, 30 years. And so I think moments in time like that become reflection points for a lot of us to think about, how do I want to spend the next 20 years? I'm reading this book called 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. A lady named Corey Munchback, who is somebody I met through Vista Partners, put it out on LinkedIn, and I saw it. And so I bought it and I've been reading it. And the premise is that the average individual has 4,000 weeks to live in their life. And, so I did the math. I did 52 times my age and subtracted it from 4,000. I now know how many weeks I have left, right? So I have to decide how I want to spend those. And I think that's, frankly, a fairly interesting way to start thinking about work-life balance. I'd encourage everybody to do that math and think about, how many of those weeks do I want to dedicate to a company?
It sounds like it's going to be the creation of your bucket list if you didn't have one already, Candace.
Oh, I have a really long bucket list.
I was going to say, I need to start building my own. Well, I love the calculated approach in that, which brings us to lesson 4. Pearls don't lie on the seashore. If you want one, you must dive for it, which came from a Chinese proverb. Now, how do you define calculated risk, and what distinguishes it from impulsive decisions?
Yeah, for me, a calculated risk is one where I've assessed the available information before I make that decision, right? And so, a metaphor for me on that is, you're not going to catch me diving off a cliff into a pool of water if I haven't gone down to the shore of that water and looked at what's underneath the surface, right? Diving off the cliff without checking what's under the surface is impulsive and probably high probability of bad outcome, right? For me personally, I would go down to the shore, take a swim in the water, no rocks under the surface. All right, I'll dive off the cliff now. But I think for me, it's that getting as much understanding of the circumstance and the situation surrounding it that allows you to make an informed decision.
Yeah, no, I think, it's always enticing when something looks so beautiful and shiny and you want to just go ahead and dive into it. But what factors do you actually consider or information when you're assessing risks and potential rewards of a decision?
Yeah, so certainly, if it's a career decision, for example, I've got to assess,
Hmm.
is this going to be the right career for me personally? Is this the right company? Is it the right role? Is it going to put me on, further down the path that I've kind of
Hmm.
outlined for my career? So you've got to think about all that. If it's a business decision, it's really thinking about, is this in alignment with either the product strategy or the corporate strategy? Competitively, what are the risks associated with making this particular decision relative to how our competitors might respond to that decision that we move
Hmm.
forward with? What are the financial implications? I learned something in the short time I was at AWS. They have this thing called a one-way door and a two-way door, which I've taken with me, right?
Hmm.
I took it away from my time there. A two-way door is one that's fairly easy to recover from. So if I make a decision and it turns out to be a bad decision or maybe not a great decision, it's easy for me to
Hmm.
reverse that. And maybe a good example is maybe you make a slight pricing adjustment to one of your products, right? Um,
Hmm.
if you raise the price slightly, nobody's going to yell at you if you take it back down to your original price, right? So that's a two-way door for
Hmm.
me. A one-way door, I think a good example is I'm going to rebrand my company, right?
Hmm.
The market knows me as X. I'm going to rebrand my company. You start rebranding your company, that feels like a one-way door to me. Once you've kind of
Yeah.
announced to the world that you're changing the name of your company, it's pretty darn hard to go back to the old one. And so I
Yeah.
think, that idea of understanding, like, if I do this, can I reverse it easily or
Hmm.
not? And if I can reverse it easily,
Hmm.
then hey, it's a calculated risk. Let's just look at, high level data and move forward. If
Right.
it's a one way door, then let's do some
Mm.
serious research before we pull the trigger on this decision.
Yeah, that is an interesting concept, and I love how you said you brought it over from AWS, and it's something that I never considered it in that way of thinking, and I think it helps you to figure out, do I need to spend more time to assess? Because I don't know, maybe because I'm in marketing, it's like a rebrand. It's like, oh my god, that could be like thousands, hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars, and then just your
Yeah.
brand cred. So it's it's huge. Now, kind of deep diving in that, when did you take a calculated risk and what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah. So I've taken a calculated risk a couple times. I mean, well, many times, but personally twice, right? And in both
Yeah.
cases, I kind of asked for a job that I didn't have. One, I was working
Mm.
for a little company called Atlas Telecom as an EA. A lady who'd left the company and gone to Mentor Graphics called me and said, "Hey, there's a EA position for the VP of marketing over here. I really want you to apply for it." And I was like, "Well, I got a job." She's like, "No, I think it'd be great." And I had interest in marketing as a long-term career. And so I was like, "Okay, I'll go interview." So I go interview. The man who was the VP, a gentleman named Dean Klanos, was an absolute like lovely person. Enjoyed the interview. He called me a couple days later, offered me the job. To which I responded, "Thank you so much. I'm very interested in the role. However, my long-term aspiration is not to be an executive assistant. It's to be in marketing.
Hmm.
So if I were to take this role and I showed a propensity for marketing, would you consider giving me a marketing role at some point in the future?" And the phone got
Hmm.
really quiet for a minute because he had just offered me a job and now I'm asking for a job, my next job, right? And he said, "Let me give it some thought and I'll call you back tomorrow." So he called me 24 hours later and he said, "Hey, if you commit to me 2 years as my EA, I'll commit to you that if you show, an aptitude for marketing, that I will move you into an entry level marketing role." We shook hands on it and I took the job. And a year and a half later, he moved me into a junior marketing role. And, that was
That's
a
amazing.
calculated risk. Yeah, because I already had
Yeah.
a job, right? I was going to be able to pay my rent, whether he gave me the job or not. Worst case
Hmm.
was he said, "Listen, I offered you a job, take it or leave it." Or he said, "I'm retracting it because you're obviously, delusional for asking me for the next job." But instead he said, you know, took a lot of courage. I appreciate that. So
Yeah.
here's my offer. and the rest is history.
Yeah.
That's how I basically
Such a bold,
eventually became a product.
that's amazing. Well, and it's such a bold move and courageous move, like you had said. Now, how are you feeling when you dropped the bomb and said, okay, now what? And he's quiet. He's like, let me come back to you. And at some point, you must have felt like relief that, yeah, I did that. But then at the second point, were you like, oh my God, did I just ruin things? Or what was going through your mind?
Well, I mean, looking back on it, I have no idea why I did it. Like, that was not me. I was not that bold, right? And I think I just had that moment where I'm like, I already have a job, right?
Yeah.
I'm paying my bills with the job I have. Do I love the job? No, but hey, it's a good job and it pays pretty well. I have nothing to lose by asking for this. Absolutely nothing. Because if they retract the offer, I still have my old job. And if they say yes, I just set myself up to transition from being an EA to being in marketing.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that brings us to lesson 5. No one cares more about your career than you do. So what does it mean to own your own career, and how can you actively take control of its progression?
Yeah. So I think most importantly, you can't take control of your career unless you know what you want your career to be. My best advice is take time. It doesn't take a lot of time. Take some time to think about what you would like to be doing in 2 to 4 years, right? I mean, I left college saying I want to be the president or CEO of a company someday. Haven't made it yet, but I still got some time, right? But every decision I made subsequent to that was pretty much, does this contribute experience, knowledge, understanding that will help me reach that goal? And I'm not saying everybody should know what they want to do 20 years out. That was probably a pretty bodacious goal on my part, but it gave me a North Star for my career. And so every time I contemplated a new role, I thought about taking a training class or getting further education. It was about, how does this get me closer? And so taking some time to actually think about, where do I want the end of this line to be in the next 2 to 4 years? And what do I think it will take to get there? And understanding that so that you can have a conversation with your boss about, hey, ultimately, this is what I'd like to do. Are there projects that I could take on that would contribute to the skill set that I'll need for that? Are there training classes internally that I could take? Do you have advice for me on how I could, work differently or better or whatever to kind of help develop what I need to attain that goal? You can't have those conversations if you don't know what you want to do.
Well, and I think it's helpful. I mean, aside from, obviously, I think soliciting feedback, sharing what it is you're looking for, making that clear, and then even taking on projects that are going to help you. How else did you take the lead in driving your own professional growth and development?
I don't have a technical degree, and I've spent almost my entire career in high tech, and a lot of it in product, where having a technical degree is pretty critical. And so, I had technical aptitude, and that helped a lot. But, I made the decision to get my MBA because I felt like getting that MBA would give me more street cred, on the business side. And luckily, product management, which is where a lot of my background is, there's a lot of business in product management. You have to be able to talk to customers. You have to be able to understand business problems. You have to be able to translate those business problems to technical problems, right? So, for me, it was like, okay, I got my undergrad. I'll get my MBA. That MBA was how I made it from being, a marketing person, like a marketing coordinator, into a product management role. That was my next step, was that MBA. And so, I sort of looked at it as, where do I think I have gaps or deficiencies that I could fill with additional education or maybe by taking a different role, even within the same company, that can help kind of fill those gaps and align better to where I want to go.
What do you feel like are some common pitfalls or even mistakes that people make when they rely too heavily on others to manage their careers?
Yeah, so a couple things come to mind. The first is when people rely on others to manage their career. So like, I've mentored a lot of people over the years, and a lot of times they'll come to me and I'll say, okay, well, let's talk about what your goal is. What do you think you want to
Mm-hmm.
do in a couple of years? And they'd be like, oh, I don't know. I'd be like, okay, it's going to be kind of hard to help you get there if you don't know where you're going, right? And so I think
Right.
there's a couple of things that are a problem with that. One, you may end up somewhere where you don't want to be if you're relying on others to manage your goal, right? Because they may
Mm-hmm.
think they know what you
Mm-hmm.
want, but in fact, if you haven't really been able to articulate that, they may take you in a direction that isn't necessarily aligned with something that would make you happy. And I think the second thing
Mm-hmm.
is, when you're relying on others, you better make sure that they know you're relying on them, because they may not want that
Yeah.
burden and they may not know that you're expecting it of them, right? And so you could end up
Mm-hmm.
on a treadmill for a really long time thinking that someone else is helping move your career along,
Mm-hmm.
when in fact they don't even know that that's what you expected of them. So I think those are the two biggest pitfalls that I've seen, is people get
Mm-hmm.
stuck. And the
Yeah.
second thing is they're not able to articulate what they really want, which makes it extremely
Yeah.
difficult for people to help them get there.
Yeah, well, it is like what you had said before. It's being clear on what it is that you want to do, in addition to having, understanding what those goals are. Now, I mean, in terms of resources and strategies, what can individuals use to help them proactively own and steer their career in that desired direction?
So I think first, write it down. And I mean, it sounds silly, but like sit down and write down, like, here's what I think I would like to be doing in 2 years or 3 years. If you feel uncomfortable going further out than that, just shoot for a couple years. Like, here's where I am today.
Yeah.
Here's where I'd love to be in 2 years. The thing is, if you write it down and then you change your mind, you just throw that piece of paper away and you write it down on a new piece of paper as it changes, right? There's
Right.
nothing wrong with changing it, but writing it down makes it very, very real. The second thing I would say is seek out people in your network that do that work, and then do informational interviews with them. Like, say, hey, could I get 30 minutes? I think what I want to do at some point is kind of what you're doing. I'd love to understand what experience and knowledge and education you needed in order to get that kind of role. And if you have any advice for me on what I could be doing to prepare myself for that role. Most people are incredibly flattered when you ask them for advice and help. So
Yeah.
don't be shy about doing that. And then the final thing is, if the job is something that you aspire to, talk to your manager about it, especially if it's within the same company, right? Most managers, not all, unfortunately, but most managers want their employees to succeed. They want them to move, up in their career, over in their career, whichever direction they want to choose, right? And so if you have that conversation, they can help you. If you're not having that conversation with them, they can't be a resource for you.
Yeah, I love that one. What it makes me think of, Candace, is early in my career, I remember I started out in sales, but I always had this love for marketing. And I remember I just wanted to be the best at what I was given and keep my head down and focus. And I remember my peers around me, there was someone in particular, and she went to our manager and said, hey, I want to be in marketing. And very quickly, he was helping her get the next marketing position. And I thought, damn it, how come I didn't say anything? And it was because that was my fault. Go figure. I thought he was a mind reader.
He didn't know that that's what you wanted. How would he know that if you didn't tell him, right? But it's amazing how often we do that to ourselves, right? We don't share what we aspire to from a career perspective, and then we're surprised when someone else gets the job. So, take control of that. That's my advice.
Yeah.